Hey guys, if you haven't checked it out yet, check out the, what's it called, Dirty John series. They released one last night, an episode on the case of Betty Broderick, and it's really interesting to see. It's very different than the movies that have been made about this case so far, because in those movies they make it look like Betty's just a crazy woman. But in the Dirty John series, it looks like they're more realistic about some of the struggles she was facing, what she was going through at the time of the tragedy back in November of 1989. I want to comment on a certain aspect of this case that I find very interesting. It seems like Betty's ex-husband's new wife wasn't satisfied with being married to Betty's ex-husband. It seems like she wasn't satisfied with her ex-husband legally having custody of the kids. It seems like she wasn't satisfied with even getting married within the same couple of days of what would have been Betty and her ex-husband's 20th wedding anniversary. And she wasn't satisfied going to Notre Dame for the annual family ritual that Betty had started. She wasn't satisfied going to the condo at the ski lodge, that Betty had found for the family to take their vacations at and to go skiing. The new wife wasn't satisfied basically living her life as if she was Betty Broderick. It sounds like she wanted more. It sounds like she wanted Betty to disappear. If you listen to some of the things that Betty Broderick has said, it sounds like she was tormented from the moment her ex-husband's new wife first started sleeping with him, many years before he finally married her. She was the office assistant who didn't know how to type, but I don't think typing was a prereq for that job. But it wasn't good enough. It wasn't good enough that she was Mrs. Daniel Broderick III. She had to still hate on Betty. I want to clarify something too. People think that she snuck into the house to go murder them because she was so upset because her ex-husband left her for a younger broad. That isn't the case at all. He had been sleeping with her for years. And when Betty first found out about it, like 6 years before the tragedy, she told him to get the hell out of her house. But he wouldn't leave. Then a few years later, they finally got divorced, and he still didn't marry his bimbo. And then a few years later, they finally got married. And again, isn't that really weird for them to get married on what would have been Betty and her ex-husband's 20th wedding anniversary? I think that's really strange. And isn't it really creepy that they went to the same place for their honeymoon that Betty and her ex-husband went to 20 years before? I mean, I think it's just creepy. But pay close attention to that dynamic of that relationship between Betty and her ex-husband's new wife. It's like the new wife only knew how to act based on the life that Betty and her ex-husband had built. And it sounds like it wasn't even what she wanted. What she really wanted was for Betty to not even exist. According to Betty's defense team, they had evidence that before the tragedy, Betty's ex-husband was supposedly looking to hire someone to kill Betty. And the court didn't allow that information to be presented at trial for the jurors to hear. And remember, there were 2 trials because the first trial ended with a hung jury, with one of the male jurors saying that his only question is what took her so long. And then the second time around, the court didn't allow a lot of the same evidence and testimony to be heard. And she was convicted. And even then, even by limiting the evidence that was able to be presented to the jury, they still didn't find her guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. She was found guilty of second-degree murder, and there's a huge difference. Because remember, and I believe this, I believe Betty is telling the truth when she says this. She never intended on killing her ex-husband and his wife. She intended on committing suicide. Connect the dots. Think about that, because leading up to the tragedy, according to Betty, her ex-husband and his new wife were pushing her to commit suicide. She went to that house that morning to kill herself. She said she was going to plead with her ex-husband to leave her the hell alone, and that if he refused to listen to her, then she was going to splatter her brains all over his walls so that he'd have to live with the sight of what he made her do. But then at the last second, while his new wife lunged toward Betty and he lunged toward the phone, according to Betty, the gun just went off. Just my opinion, I don't think Betty Broderick belongs in prison. I think she has already served many more years than she should have been forced to serve. She did kill her ex-husband. Yes, she did kill her ex-husband's new wife. But just my opinion, I think that all the evidence of what she had suffered through for years leading up to the tragedy, I think if that evidence was heard by the jury, I think it's quite possible they would have voted not guilty. Just my opinion.